Late afternoon in the winter of 1945, on the western edge of the village of Holtzweiler in eastern France, the war slowed into a dangerous quiet. Snow covered the fields and farmyards, smoothing over shell holes and frozen blood alike. Smoke from earlier fighting drifted low and heavy, blurring the outlines of barns and sheds. The sun was already sinking, weak and pale, casting long shadows across the white ground. The main battle had moved on, but the land still felt tense, as if it were holding its breath. Out of this silence, a single American soldier stepped forward from the trees and walked into the open. He did not run. He did not crawl. He walked upright, boots crunching loudly on the frozen snow, fully visible against the white ground. Anyone watching could see at once that he was alone. No squad followed him. No covering fire protected him. His uniform was worn and dark with dirt and smoke, his face tight with exhaustion, yet his movement was steady. This was not a man stumbling in panic. This was a man choosing where to place his feet. Ahead of him lay a farmyard filled with German soldiers. Dozens of them stood clustered near the buildings, rifles slung or held loosely at the ready. Some had been talking. Others had been watching the distant fighting, confident the danger had passed them by. When they noticed the American walking toward them, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Weapons came up, but without urgency. To them, the situation seemed clear. One enemy soldier, cut off from his unit, had finally accepted reality. Outnumbered beyond hope, he must be surrendering. The American stopped in the open yard, surrounded on nearly every side. Snow fell lightly between him and the Germans. He was close enough now for them to see his expression clearly, close enough to hear his breathing in the cold air. Orders were shouted in German, sharp and commanding, telling him to raise his hands and stand still. Yet he did neither. He remained where he was, shoulders loose, posture calm, eyes moving slowly across the faces in front of him. Then something unexpected happened. The American smiled. Not a wide grin, not a nervous twitch, but a controlled, knowing smile. A moment later he laughed. It was brief and dry, the sound of a man who found the situation almost absurd. The laugh cut through the cold air and landed hard in the yard. It did not belong there. Several German soldiers hesitated. A few glanced at one another confused. This was not what defeat was supposed to look like. This was not how a surrender began. In that brief pause, while confidence turned into uncertainty, the balance of the moment shifted. The Germans still believed they were in control, still trusted their numbers and their weapons. But the Americans' calm, that single laugh, had cracked their certainty. They did not yet understand why, only that something about this lone soldier was wrong. And in war, when expectation and reality collide, the results can be sudden and devastating. The American soldier standing in that farmyard was not there by accident. Hours earlier, the fight around Holtzweiler had dissolved into chaos. Units were scattered. Orders were lost in the noise of artillery and machine gun fire. Men moved forward, then backward, then sideways, often without knowing who still held the ground ahead. In that confusion, he had become separated from his company, pushed deeper than intended into enemy-held territory. By the time the firing faded, he found himself alone, with no friendly voices, no clear path back. He understood the danger immediately. German troops were everywhere in the sector, falling back but still deadly. Most men in his position would have tried to hide, to wait for night, or to crawl away inch by inch. He did none of that. He moved carefully through the snow, listening, watching, testing each step. And then he saw the farmyard. A cluster of enemy soldiers gathered in one place, relaxed enough to stand close together. To most soldiers, it would have looked like a trap. To him, it looked like something else. As he approached, his mind worked fast. He noticed how tightly packed they were, how their attention was scattered, how their confidence showed in their posture. These were not men expecting a fight at arm's length. They believed the area was secure. They believed no American would be foolish enough to walk straight toward them alone. That belief was his opening. Standing there now, surrounded, he could feel their eyes on him. He could sense the moment stretching longer than it should. On a battlefield, hesitation is rare. Someone usually fires quickly, driven by fear or training. But here, the Germans hesitated because they thought they understood the situation. They thought this moment belonged to them. They thought time was on their side. The American knew otherwise. Inside his jacket and pockets were weapons the Germans had not yet noticed. Grenades, heavy and cold against his body. He had used them before, knew exactly how long it took to pull a pin, how far he could throw, how quickly chaos would spread in a tight group of men. He also knew something else, something experience had taught him the hard way. When soldiers expect surrender, their reactions slow. Orders become confused. Seconds are lost. Those seconds were everything. As the snow continued to fall, he shifted his weight slightly, a movement so small it drew no attention. His hand moved with calm precision. The Germans were still watching his face, still trying to read his intent, still waiting for raised hands that never came. Their rifles were aimed, but their minds were not ready. The American's laugh had done its work. It had planted doubt where certainty had been. And now, with the yard silent and every man focused on him, he prepared to turn that doubt into violence. What followed would happen so fast that many of the Germans would never understand how the situation had reversed. They would remember only noise, smoke, and bodies falling into the snow. But before that storm broke, there was this final moment of stillness, when one man stood surrounded by enemies, fully aware that the next move would decide whether he lived or died. The moment broke without warning. 1 second the yard was quiet, filled with drifting snow and uncertain stares. The next, the American moved. His hand came up fast, practiced, pulling a grenade from his jacket as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The metal pin came free with a sharp snap that several Germans heard too late. Before any shout could turn into an order, the grenade left his hand and landed in the middle of the group. For an instant, no one reacted. Minds struggled to catch up with what eyes were seeing. Then the explosion ripped through the yard. Snow, dirt, and fragments of wood and steel burst upward. Men were thrown off their feet. Screams cut through the smoke. The tight cluster that moments ago had felt so safe became a trap. The American did not stop. Even before the first explosion faded, another grenade was already in motion. He stepped forward aggressively, not back, throwing himself into the chaos he had created. A second blast tore through the yard, closer to the buildings, catching men as they tried to scatter. Rifles fell into the snow. Some soldiers turned to run. Others froze, unsure where the danger was coming from. Gunfire erupted, wild and uncontrolled. German soldiers fired in every direction, some shooting past their own men, others firing blindly into smoke. The careful order of moments earlier was gone. Training collapsed under shock. Officers shouted commands that no one could hear clearly. The yard filled with noise, confusion, and panic. The American pressed the attack. He moved constantly, changing position, using the smoke and noise to mask his movements. He fired at close range, picking targets that appeared suddenly through the haze. He did not rush blindly. Each movement was deliberate. Each shot was taken with purpose. The Germans, still trying to understand what had happened, could not track him. Snow that had been clean and white minutes before was now torn apart by explosions and footsteps. Dark shapes lay scattered across the ground. Some men were wounded and crawling. Others did not move at all. The farmyard, once a place of confidence, had turned into a killing ground. What shocked the surviving Germans most was not just the violence, but the speed of it. They had believed they were facing a surrender. Instead, they were caught in a sudden, aggressive assault that gave them no time to recover. Numbers meant nothing when fear took over. Weapons meant little when no one knew where to aim. The American felt the seconds passing, knew he could not slow down. He understood that if the Germans regained control, if they reorganized even briefly, he would be overwhelmed. So he kept pushing, kept firing, kept moving forward as if he were part of a much larger force. To the men in the yard, it felt as though an entire unit had descended on them out of nowhere. In less than a minute, the fight had changed completely. The laughter that had confused the Germans now seemed almost unreal, replaced by the harsh reality of close combat. Survivors began to break away, fleeing toward cover, desperate to escape the yard. Others dropped their weapons, stunned and bleeding, unable to continue. When the noise finally began to fade, the yard was unrecognizable. Smoke drifted where men had once stood shoulder to shoulder. The American slowed, breathing hard, scanning for any remaining threat. He was still alive. Still standing. And around him, the snow told the story of how quickly certainty could turn into disaster. As the last echoes of gunfire faded, a heavy silence settled over the farmyard. Smoke drifted slowly between the buildings, thick and bitter in the cold air. The American stood still for a moment, listening. No shouted orders. No sudden movement. Only the low groans of wounded men and the soft hiss of burning debris breaking the quiet. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind remained sharp. This was not the moment to relax. This was the moment when mistakes killed survivors. He moved carefully now, stepping through the churned snow, weapon raised, eyes sweeping from left to right. Bodies lay scattered across the yard, some twisted where they had fallen, others half buried in snow thrown up by the blasts. Rifles and helmets lay abandoned, dropped in panic. A few Germans were still alive, wounded and stunned, staring at him with disbelief. They had not expected to be alive. They had not expected him to be standing there. Some of the Germans had fled toward the edges of the farm, disappearing between buildings or into nearby cover. They ran without formation, without orders, driven only by fear. The American let them go. Chasing them would have been suicide. He knew better than to follow fleeing men into unknown ground. Survival now depended on discipline, not anger or pride. He paused near the center of the yard and looked around, trying to understand what he had just done. Less than a minute earlier, he had been surrounded by nearly 90 armed enemies. Now the ground around him was littered with bodies and wounded men. The scale of it was almost unreal. There was no time to think about it deeply. Shock could slow him down, and slowing down could kill him. He checked his weapon, then his remaining grenades. Not many left. Enough, maybe, to buy time if needed. He listened again, straining to hear footsteps or shouted commands beyond the smoke. Somewhere nearby, German units still held ground. Somewhere else, American forces were trying to push forward. He was still deep in enemy territory. Then, from beyond the farmyard, he heard it. American voices. At first, faint and uncertain, carried on the cold air. Then clearer. Shouts. Commands in English. The sound of boots moving fast. Friendly voices cutting through the smoke like a lifeline. Relief threatened to wash over him, but he forced it down. Until he saw them, until he was sure, he could not afford to relax. Moments later, American soldiers appeared at the edge of the yard, weapons raised, expecting resistance. What they found stopped them cold. They stared at the scene in disbelief. Bodies in the snow. Wounded Germans sitting or lying where they had fallen. And in the middle of it all, one American soldier, alone, covered in smoke and grime, still alert. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The Americans looked from the yard to the lone soldier and back again, trying to understand what had happened here. It looked like the aftermath of a full assault, the kind of destruction caused by a coordinated attack. But there was no sign of another unit. No evidence of support. Just one man and the frozen remains of a fight that should never have been possible. The soldier did not celebrate. He did not boast. He simply reported what he had seen, what he had done, and what direction the Germans had fled. His voice was calm, almost flat, as if he were describing something ordinary. Yet the men listening knew better. They were standing in the proof of something extraordinary. As American troops secured the farmyard, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. Medics moved carefully among the wounded, both friend and enemy, their boots crunching through the blood-stained snow. Officers counted bodies, checked buildings, and searched for signs of a larger German force nearby. Again and again, they reached the same conclusion. This fight had not been the result of a coordinated attack. It had been the work of one man acting alone. Word spread quickly through the nearby units. Soldiers pointed toward the yard and shook their heads in disbelief. Stories began to form almost immediately, each retelling growing heavier with shock. Nearly 90 German soldiers had stood here. Most had been killed, wounded, or scattered in less than a minute. It sounded impossible. Yet the evidence lay frozen in front of them. The American soldier himself showed little reaction. He sat briefly near a wall, catching his breath, steam rising from his uniform. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear now, but from the release of tension. Combat had a way of keeping men focused until the danger passed. Only afterward did the body begin to react. Even then, he did not speak much. He knew how close he had come to dying, and he knew that thinking too hard about it would change nothing. What had allowed him to survive was not strength or luck alone. It was timing, instinct, and a deep understanding of how men behaved under pressure. The Germans had believed they were safe. They had believed numbers guaranteed control. When that belief was shattered, panic replaced order. In those moments, training vanished. Fear took over. And fear, when shared by many men at once, spread faster than fire. The laughter mattered more than anyone realized at the time. It broke the pattern the Germans expected to see. It forced hesitation where there should have been immediate action. That hesitation gave him the seconds he needed to act. In close combat, seconds decide everything. Not minutes. Not even half a minute. Just a brief pause is enough to turn the outcome upside down. Later, as reports were written and accounts were gathered, officers struggled to put the event into proper words. Paper did not easily capture what instinct and chaos had created. Numbers looked unreal when written down. The idea that one man could walk into a group of armed enemies and survive, let alone dominate the encounter, went against everything taught in manuals and classrooms. Yet war had never cared much for rules. By nightfall, the farmyard was quiet again. Snow continued to fall, slowly covering the marks of violence. The bodies were removed. The wounded were taken away. The ground began to look almost peaceful, as if nothing extraordinary had happened there at all. But the men who had seen it would remember that place for the rest of their lives. And for the American soldier, the war was not over. This moment, as shocking as it was, would become only one chapter in a much larger story. A story that would soon reach far beyond that frozen yard in Alsace. In the days that followed, the story of the farmyard spread quietly through the ranks. Soldiers told it in low voices while cleaning weapons or warming their hands near fires. Each man who heard it tried to picture the moment. One American, walking alone into a group of enemies, laughing when surrender was expected. Some shook their heads and called it madness. Others understood something deeper. On the battlefield, confidence could be as deadly as any weapon. Commanders took notice. After-action reports mentioned the encounter in careful language stripped of emotion, but the facts remained hard to ignore. An isolated soldier had neutralized a large enemy force at a critical moment. The German troops in that area had been thrown into confusion, buying time for American units to reorganize and push forward. What happened in that small yard had influenced the fight far beyond its size. The American soldier was questioned about the event. He answered simply. He explained what he had seen, what he had decided, and what he had done. He did not describe himself as brave. He spoke instead of opportunity. Of how the Germans were grouped together. Of how they hesitated. Of how there was no other choice once the moment presented itself. To him, it was not a legend. It was a decision made under pressure. Those who listened realized something important. This was not a reckless act. It was controlled aggression, guided by experience and awareness. He had understood the enemy's expectations and used them against them. Where others might have frozen or tried to run, he had moved forward, turning weakness into advantage. The Germans who survived told a different story. To them, the American had seemed unreal, almost impossible. Some claimed they believed they were facing more than one attacker. Others swore there must have been hidden support nearby. None wanted to admit how completely surprise and fear had unraveled them. Their confidence had been their greatest vulnerability. As winter dragged on, the fighting in Alsace continued, but moments like this became symbols among the troops. Proof that war was not only decided by tanks and artillery, but by individuals who recognized the exact second when the rules no longer applied. The American soldier returned to duty, carrying the memory with him, but rarely speaking of it unless asked. He knew something many veterans understood. In war, survival often depends on acting when others hesitate, on moving when everyone else waits, on doing the one thing the enemy never expects. And that understanding would follow him long after the snow melted and the guns finally fell silent. As the war in Europe pushed toward its final months, the encounter at Holzwehr slowly took on a life of its own. It became more than just a report or a rumor passed between tired soldiers. It became a lesson. In training areas and command tents, officers spoke about the incident when discussing initiative and decision-making under fire. They did not glorify the violence. They pointed to the mindset behind it. The understanding that war rewards those who act decisively when others expect hesitation. The American soldier returned to the rhythm of combat, but something had changed. Men around him looked at him differently now. Not with awe, but with a quiet respect. They knew what he had faced. They knew how close the margin had been. No one asked him to retell the story for entertainment. It was understood that some moments were too sharp to revisit lightly. The German side learned its own lesson. In the collapsing days of the Reich, confidence could no longer be taken for granted. Units were reminded that surrender could be a deception, that hesitation could be fatal. But these warnings came too late to matter. By early 1945, German forces were stretched thin, exhausted, and losing ground everywhere. The farmyard at Holzwehr was not the cause of that collapse, but it was a sign of it. What made the incident endure was not the number of casualties alone. It was the reversal of expectation. A moment where strength appeared weak, and weakness became deadly. 90 armed men believed they controlled the situation. One man understood that control existed only as long as everyone believed it did. Once that belief cracked, everything fell apart. Years later, historians would examine such moments carefully. They would strip away exaggeration and focus on what could be proven. Even then, the core of the story remained intact. The terrain. The numbers. The sudden violence. The role of surprise and psychology. This was not a myth built from nothing. It was a real event shaped by human behavior under extreme stress. The snow in Alsace eventually melted. The farm returned to quiet work. Crops grew where soldiers had once stood shoulder to shoulder. But the land had witnessed something rare. A moment where war compressed itself into less than a minute and revealed how fragile certainty could be. For the American soldier, the memory stayed vivid. Not as triumph, but as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly life could hinge on a single choice. A single step forward instead of back. A single laugh that bought the seconds needed to survive. With time, the story of what happened near Holzwehr was placed into its proper historical frame. This was not an isolated act of chaos, but a reflection of how the war in early 1945 had changed. Front lines were blurred. Units were shattered and reformed again and again. Soldiers often fought without clear orders, relying on instinct rather than command. In such conditions, individual action could shape outcomes in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The American soldiers' encounter showed how psychological dominance could outweigh numerical strength. The Germans had been armed and numerous, yet unprepared for aggression from a man they believed defeated. Their expectation of surrender created a pause, and that pause was decisive. In close combat, surprise does not need to last long. It only needs to last long enough. Military historians later pointed to this moment as an example of initiative under extreme pressure. Not because it should be copied blindly, but because it revealed something timeless. Battlefields are shaped as much by human perception as by weapons. When perception fails, even overwhelming strength can collapse. For the men who arrived at the farmyard afterward, the scene remained unforgettable. Many would later say that it changed how they viewed combat. They became more cautious. more alert to the unexpected. They learned that danger often came from the place that seemed least threatening. The German soldiers who survived carried their own memory. Some spoke of confusion, of believing they were under attack by a larger force. Others admitted that they froze, unable to react when events unfolded faster than thought. These accounts, taken together, confirmed what the American already knew that day. He had not defeated 90 men through firepower alone. He had defeated their assumptions. As the war ended and Europe began to rebuild, moments like this risked being lost among larger battles and famous names. Yet they mattered. They showed how ordinary soldiers, placed in extraordinary situations, could alter the course of events through judgment and nerve. The farmyard at Holzwehr did not appear on maps of major battles. There were no grand monuments marking the ground. But history does not always announce itself with scale. Sometimes it reveals itself in silence, in a brief pause before violence, in a laugh that breaks expectation and turns the balance of life and death. As historians looked back on the final winter of the war in Europe, they saw countless moments where the outcome hinged on small decisions made under immense pressure. The encounter at Holzwehr stood out not because it changed the direction of the war, but because it captured its raw reality. War was not always grand offensives and sweeping movements. Often, it was a handful of seconds, a few meters of ground, and a choice made with no time to reconsider. The American soldier never sought recognition for what he had done. Like many veterans, he returned to his unit and carried on. There were more fights ahead. More cold nights. More moments where survival depended on staying alert when exhaustion begged for rest. The war did not pause to reflect on what had happened in that yard, and neither did he. Yet the story endured because it spoke to something universal. The power of initiative. The danger of assumption. The fragile nature of control in combat. 90 armed men believed they had already won. One man understood that belief could be used against them. That understanding made the difference. In later years, those who studied the events stripped away exaggeration and focused on evidence. They compared accounts from both sides. They examined terrain, troop movements, and timing. What remained was a clear picture. Surprise created shock. Shock created paralysis. And paralysis, even among trained soldiers, could be fatal. For viewers today, the lesson is not about heroics alone. It is about awareness. About recognizing when the expected pattern no longer applies. The American's laughter was not bravado. It was a signal, intentional or not, that he was not playing the role assigned to him. That single break in expectation opened the door to everything that followed. When the snow finally melted and the war moved into memory, the yard returned to being just a farm. No one walking there years later would know what had happened. But history remembers not the place, but the moment. A moment when confidence failed, hesitation spread, and one man survived by acting while others waited. By the time the war in Europe ended, countless stories like this had faded into the background, overshadowed by famous battles and well-known commanders. Yet moments like the one at Holzwehr reveal the true nature of combat more clearly than any map or headline. They show how quickly order can dissolve, how fragile confidence becomes under pressure, and how a single human decision can reshape the outcome of a deadly encounter. The American soldier's survival did not come from strength alone. It came from understanding people. He recognized hesitation when he saw it. He sensed confidence turning into uncertainty. And he acted in the narrow window where fear had not yet turned back into control. That window lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The Germans in that yard believed the fight was over before it began. They expected surrender. They expected obedience. When reality broke those expectations, their numbers meant nothing. Training could not compensate for surprise. Weapons could not overcome confusion. In war, belief often matters as much as firepower. This is why the moment endures. Not because of how many men were present, but because of how quickly the balance shifted. One laugh, out of place and unexpected, changed everything. It created doubt where certainty had ruled. It froze action long enough for the situation to reverse. History often remembers generals and grand strategies. But wars are also shaped by individuals standing alone, making choices with no guarantee of survival. The farmyard near Holzweiler reminds us that courage is not always loud, and victory is not always planned. Sometimes it is a calm decision made in the middle of overwhelming danger. In the end, the snow covered the evidence, and the war moved on. But the lesson remains. On the battlefield, the side that controls the moment controls the outcome. And sometimes, control begins with doing the one thing no one expects.